Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host Heidi, and welcome to 2019. It is a new year, so Happy New Year to all of you listeners out there. Thank you so much for tuning in this new 2019. I am excited. We are in a new year. We are leaving 2018 behind, and the new year is definitely a time when people make changes in their lives, but I feel like also take stock of their lives, because to figure out what you want to change, you have to figure out what you're already doing. And I think with that, it can apply a lot to our health and our wellness. And when I think about that, I mean, I'm not crazy, so I'm not going to make a giant exercising thing that I think I should do, because I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to set myself up for that. But I think a lot about diet and about what I'm eating, and about what I guess the people around me are eating, and how everyone can care for themselves through their diet, through what they're putting in their bodies. And I feel relatively passionate about that. And so I think for me in 2019, I definitely want to think about the food that I'm eating. And with that in mind, I started thinking about the topic of diet. And that is what we're going to be talking about in this episode. I am excited about it because as I was reading, I learned some things that I did not know about how your diet can affect your mood. Specifically, I want to talk about diet, not like, you know, like people talk about like Atkins and keto and paleo or Weight Watchers, or, you know, I'm not talking about like changing what you eat and like cutting out sugar so you can lose weight. I mean getting a healthy diet in your lives to live a better and happier life, sort of like a full lifestyle change, not necessarily just a diet. Because to me, I think diets can often be seen as like temporary things, or things that will eventually you'll just stop doing. And that's not what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that if people want to change the food that they're eating, that they can go in a way that is more permanent, in a way that is a more nourishing lifestyle. So again, that's what really encouraged me looking into this topic. And I've been reading specifically about how our diets can have a link to depression, actually. And it's really interesting. I was excited to read some of the research that I'll be sharing with you all. And I didn't know, like I always believed how much the food that you're eating and the nutrients and all that you're taking in can affect you. But I really didn't know scientifically what it had to do, like how your mood had to connect with diet. But I also didn't know that other people have done research on this topic. So I'm just very excited about that. Before we go into the topic, we will be talking about depression, just so you know and are aware. And I wanted to start off by explaining, I guess, what is depression. And then we're also going to mention serotonin. So I want to talk about what that is. So I want to clarify there is a connection between serotonin and diet. So we also want to mention what the connection between serotonin and depression is. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter in your body that helps regulate sleep and appetite, and it mediates mood and can inhibit pain. There are many researchers who believe that an imbalance in serotonin levels may influence mood in a way that lead to depression. And there can be different problems related to serotonin, but we're going to be focusing specifically on depression. Also, 95% of your serotonin is produced in your gastrointestinal tract, and your gastrointestinal tract is lined with 100 million nerve cells or neurons. So really it makes sense that the inner workings of your digestive system don't just digest food, but they can also guide some of your emotions. And I think that when I read that, that helped set up the connection between diet and the topic of diet and mood, specifically diet and depression. So I found that interesting, and I think oftentimes reading about depression I hear like serotonin because that's something in connection to a lot of like medications that people take for depression. So I was really interested to see how that connected with food. Also, I'm not saying that changing your diet should necessarily just replace medication. Basically, anywhere that I read about this, any psychologist, any doctor, were all saying that they're not telling you to cut out your medication. A lot of times people have found a combination of diet and medication to be the most helpful, and I'll talk a little bit more about sort of like the results of diet change on depression, but I am not here on the podcast to advocate that people get rid of medication. I'm not here to say that medication for depression is bad or that you shouldn't need it. That's not what I mean. I don't want to be misinterpreted in that way. So now that we have got that disclaimer out of the way and I have talked about serotonin, I want to talk specifically about something that I read from the Harvard Medical Journal, and I found this to be very interesting. I also found the Harvard Medical Journal to be a pretty good source. So if anyone is interested in the topics that I'm going to discuss, you can go there. So, diet is a very important component of your mental health. In fact, it has inspired an entire field of medicine called nutritional psychiatry, which again, I didn't know existed, so I think that's very interesting. Really, what this field is studying is that what we eat matters for every aspect of our health, specifically our mental health. Several recent research analysis looking at multiple studies support that there's a link between what one eats and our risk of depression. I also will be mentioning later the Mediterranean diet, which came up a lot when I was looking at this, which again I found very interesting. I actually started looking at this from like a different angle when I was reading about the Mediterranean diet. I want to say it's the New York Times, but I did read an article also about Mediterranean diet, and that was really interesting. I will mention that, but it does have a connection here to what we're going to be talking about. So there was one analysis that concluded a dietary pattern characterized by a high intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grain, fish, olive oil, low-fat dairy and antioxidants, and low intakes of animal food was apparently associated with a decreased risk of depression. Also, I think when they're saying animal food, which is a weird way to say it, I think they're speaking of like fattier meats and things like that. So if you're like increasing other good things and decreasing some of your intake of like fatty red meat and such, they're saying that is associated with a decreased risk of depression. Again, very interesting stuff. Also, a dietary pattern characterized by a high consumption of red and or processed meat, refined grains, sweets, high-fat dairy products, butter, potatoes, and high-fat gravy, and low intakes of fruit and vegetables is associated with an increased risk of depression. So I feel like when I read this, and I feel like even more when I say it, I think this is information like, yes, duh, of course, we know that. No one's ever saying that like eating Doritos is good for you. And I agree. I think everyone kind of understands that. Not to say that people don't still eat Doritos. Not to say that I don't still love Doritos, because I really do. But not only are they saying it's bad for you and it's not like a health food, definitely, but they're saying that it can influence depression. So that's like taking it to a whole nother level, at least in my mind, a whole nother idea of like, not only, will Cheetos like dye your fingers orange from the powder, but it could increase your risk of depression, which is crazy, especially if you're someone who is prone to that. I just think this is a super interesting topic. Also, I feel like saying things like, oh, yes, food like fruits and vegetables are good for you. Generally, when reading about food, I just come away thinking like anything that is actually grown or like harvested is good for you. It's not like they're like picking like, Cheetos off a tree. Like that's not a natural food product. And that kind of relates to like the whole food movement. I'm not saying the store, but the idea of eating like whole foods, like whole grains and like, like eating like a whole apple as opposed to just like Mott's apple juice or something. Not that the Mott's company should come after me, because if they did, they would totally ruin me. But like food that is grown is nourishing for you, which I guess you could argue, well, Cheetos are made out of corn and corn is ground. Well, yeah, that's a bit of a stretch. That's not a whole food. That's a processed food. So I think that this idea does really relate to a lot of like food movements that are going on right now. I mean, I said Whole Foods like the movement, but also the store, Whole Foods, which just caters to this idea of healthy food and that's nourishing food. That I feel like is popular right now, and I see why. I feel like it is backed by science, and it is backed by legitimate research, which I did look at a little bit of. I'm not a nutritionist, but I do feel like that is interesting. So I was happy to read that. I felt like it coincided to things that I already kind of felt and believed in. Again, not that I'm cutting out Doritos from my lifestyle, because I just couldn't do that. Sometimes I'll just like go a week where I'm like, no chips. And then a week later, I really just want everything that's fried and salty. And then I, eat a bunch of Ruffles or whatever. And then the next week I'm like, all right, this time I'm really cutting them out for good. It never works, which is again, why I'm not talking here specifically about diet, which I feel like, or a diet, which I feel like can be temporary. I'm talking more about a lifestyle involving your diet, involving what you eat. I think that's a pretty good distinction because, again, I don't think just like cold turkey cutting certain things out or like cutting processed foods out or just a bunch of sugar, that's really difficult. And I think that that's not necessarily sustainable. You should, treat yourself once in a while. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to keep talking about diet and how that can connect to depression.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast. We are continuing to talk about how your diet, the foods that you eat, can affect your mood. Specifically, we're talking about depression in this episode. So I want to continue talking about some of the research that I've got from the Harvard Medical Journal. One could argue that being depressed makes us more likely to eat unhealthy foods. I definitely think that can happen for sure. And that can be true. But I think also you want to think about like what came first, the diet or the depression. Another large analysis looked only at prospective studies, meaning they looked at baseline diet and then calculated the risk of study volunteers going on to develop depression. And researchers found that a healthy diet, which, as I've said before, kind of like the Mediterranean diet as an example, was associated with a significantly lower risk of developing depressive symptoms. And there are several healthy options that could be used as a guide. Again, the Mediterranean diet, which is kind of like an example they looked at here. But again, I'll be mentioning that later in the show. The bottom line generally is that eating plants, and lots of them, including, fruits, veggies, whole grains, and whole grains are like literally like the whole grain. So you're not stripping away the shell, the endosperm, you're taking all the parts of the grain. Like barley is a whole grain, farro wheat, I don't know if I'm saying that right. Also quinoa, even though technically quinoa is a seed, you can kind of count that in this whole grain thing. And it's like an unprocessed form of grain generally. Seeds, nuts, lean proteins like fish and yogurt, and then to avoid things like added sugars, again, flours, so things like breads, baked goods, cereals, and pastas, and then to minimize animal fats and processed meats. Processed meats are like bacon or like your deli meats, like deli ham or whatever, deli turkey, and also butter. But granted, again, the occasional intake of these bad foods, in quote, is okay. with everything in moderation. Also, for those who are trying to lose weight, you really can't go wrong with colorful fruits and vegetables, and quality matters over quantity. So it's important to think about the quality of the food that you're eating. So again, like Cheetos is compared to like an apple. Even more if you want to go like a really quality apple, maybe not like a Red Delicious that you pick up from like a hotel lobby, like Fruit Basket or something, but the quality of it. So again, this bottom line of the suggested things that you eat, the things that they want you to avoid, and just like how eating the healthy foods can help you lose weight if that's what you're after. These things are the better options for you. And this description of foods to eat and foods to avoid is what has been linked to avoiding depression, like potentially suppressing your risk of developing depression, or like those who already have depression, improving your mood, and helping with depression. I want to mention a study to support this claim that I found really interesting, and it does support the claim that diet can influence depression. So, Felice Jacka, who is a doctor and researcher at Deakin University in Australia, she found, and this is a study that was published January 30th, 2017, the study published her new randomized controlled study. She called it the SMILES trial. And the team recruited 67 men and women with moderate to severe depression who reported eating a relatively unhealthy diet. Most were taking antidepressants and or going to see regular psychotherapy. Psychotherapy often just refers to like therapy and can be conducted in different, ways, like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, psychodynamic therapy, or a combination of several. Basically, when they're saying psychotherapy, they're just saying what we think of generally as just therapy, going to see a therapist regularly and talking with them. So in these study participants, they put half of these depressed people on a modified Mediterranean diet and required them to attend dietary support sessions with a nutritionist. Which, again, this is a pretty interesting study. And I feel like they did this well, where you could consider like maybe someone has a placebo related to this diet or something. I think they controlled for that well. So there was one half that went on the Mediterranean diet. The other half continued eating their unusual, unhealthy diet. But this is the part that I think they used to control well, because it could have just been like, oh, nothing's changing. And then you could get more depressed if you could think, oh, something's changing, and then have a placebo come in and make you feel better because you think something's changing. I think they did really good with this. The other part that did not, the other half of the group that continued to eat their unhealthy diet were required to attend social support befriending sessions. Befriending sessions are like meeting regularly with other people to do like social activities, like playing cards and with just like light chatting, kind of. So it's not necessarily therapy. It's just like kind of seeing random people occasionally to like, lightly chat, which I guess for some they could consider that would just bring on depression if like you just hate small talk. So I'm sorry if you just hate the elevator talks when you just see someone else and you kind of have to chat as you're going up like 5 floors. Maybe this would make it worse for you. I don't know. So they did the study, and before and after the 12-week study, everyone's depression symptoms were graded using several different tests. The test this research group chose to focus on was the, I'm just going to say the acronym, is the MADRS scale, which is the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, which rates mood on a scale of 0 to 60. 60 would be the most severely depressed. So they took the ratings of these study participants before and after using this scale and using other scales, but this is the one I specifically read about in this study. After 12 weeks, people in the Mediterranean diet group, the ones who changed their diet, saw the test scores improve on an average by about 11 points. 32%, so 10 out of 31 study completers, had a score so low that they no longer met criteria for depression, which is amazing. So let me just say that again. Of the people who participated and had their diet changed, so about half the group, 10 out of 31 of those people had scores so low that they no longer met the criteria for depression. 32% of the people who changed their diet were no longer depressed. That's awesome. I don't know. I read this and I was like, well, that completely proves it. I just wanted to close my laptop and say, that was it. I'm doing this no matter what. Also of interest, calories. Oh, sorry. One more point about the other group. People in the unhealthy diet group improved only about 4 points on the test, and only 8% achieved remission. Remission is when they're saying like, oh, they don't meet the criteria for depression. So they're not saying that this group who went to the befriending sessions didn't improve. That did help for some people, but it was a lower percentage of people who really weren't considered depressed anymore. So people who were moderately depressed, half of them they put on a Mediterranean diet, and of the half that were on the Mediterranean diet and completed the study, 32% met the criteria for no longer met the criteria for depression. Basically saying they were no longer depressed. The other half that did the befriending, 8% were no longer depressed. That's really cool. I really enjoyed reading this study. The diet plan. So they were saying calories were not restricted, so body weight stayed about the same for everyone in the study. So people didn't really have to lose weight to feel better, which is also very encouraging. And the diet plan was apparently easier to stick to than the social support plan, and since more people in the diet group, 31 out of 33, made it all the way to the end of the study, compared to only 25 out of 34 people in the support group. So again, I mean, if you just hate small talk, perhaps that was just worse for you. Sorry, I should not joke about depression. But so they did say it was easier to stick to the diet plan than to stick to going to the befriending sessions. So that's also really cool. So I really enjoyed reading that as well. Also, I want to go in and talk about specifically what the Mediterranean diet is, or also called a modified Mediterranean diet, which is what they use in this study. And it is an interesting diet. I've basically mentioned the components earlier with the kind of foods that they're suggesting people eat, the kind of foods they're suggesting that you avoid. Also, Mediterranean, it's called that because it's related to the groups of people who live around the Mediterranean and the types of foods they typically eat. So like, basically I thought of like Italy mostly, which again, I'm looking at and I'm thinking like, well, there's a lot of pasta and whatnot. But after reading this, I'm like, maybe I just have a very wrong view of what Italians would normally eat. Maybe I have like a view of like an Italian-American type diet. So I apologize to anyone in Italy if I'm just completely off base. But that was an interesting thing to read. I enjoyed reading about that study. And again, I just read this and I was like, well, for sure. This is definitely helping. I'm definitely like, I don't consider myself depressed or on the risk of being depressed, but I'm like, wow, this diet is great anyway. Also, you can't go wrong by eating like more fruits and vegetables. So I was excited to read that. So the Mediterranean diet, or the modified Mediterranean diet, which I saw some people wrote as ModiMed, which I think is kind of a silly name. I think it sounds dumb, so I'm not going to say it. But again, the foods that they're encouraging, as I've said before, are just like the plant-based foods, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, so like beans, low-fat, unsweetened dairy, nuts, but specifically raw, unsalted nuts. So not like the candied nuts that you get like at Christmas or whatnot, or like the candied pecans that come in your salad, which I'm sorry, but raw, unsalted. Lean red meat. And if you're looking specifically at lean red meat, if you just type into Google, they'll give you the different cuts of lean red meat, but that's like not hamburger meat. You can find the specifics. And you can ask your butcher as well if you want to get it. But again, it's not like you can't just eat a hamburger without like the bread and say that you're doing this diet. That's not necessarily true. So lean red meat, chicken, fish, eggs, and then replacing butter with healthy fats such as olive oil. Again, I feel like olive oil is just synonymous with Italian cooking. So before I continue talking about this diet, we're going to take a break and then we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the Health and Wellness Podcast. We are continuing to talk about diet. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Mediterranean diet, or also known as the modified Mediterranean diet. So I had mentioned some of the other things that they are encouraging. To continue with encouraged ingredients and food, they are saying that herbs and spices are good to use instead of just like salt to flavor foods. So I don't think they're saying cut out salt and don't use it, but like maybe as opposed to just heavily or overly salting your food, maybe try a different like herb or spice blend, which add flavor, which aren't necessarily making you feel like you have to put more salt to taste your food. Also, they are limiting red meat specifically to like no more than a few times a month. Sorry, that's not specific, but to no more than a few times a month. Also, this is interesting. They're particularly mentioning fatty fish. So, encouraged foods, they said fish, but I didn't really think about what type of fish. But fatty fish such as mackerel, lake trout, herring, sardines, albacore tuna, and salmon, they're all rich sources of omega-3 fatty acids. Also, fish is eaten on a regular basis in a Mediterranean diet, which makes sense for people living on the Mediterranean, which is, a body of water, so they're able to fish from there and get a lot of their protein sources that way. They're also saying eat your veggies and fruit and switch to whole grains. And like an abundance and a variety of plant foods should make up the majority of your meals. So strive for 7 to 10 servings a day of fruits and veggies. Switch to whole grain bread and cereal, and begin to eat more whole grain rice and pasta products. So like brown rice as opposed to white rice, and whole grain pasta. So they're not saying you can't eat pasta, but they're saying like whole grain pasta is better. They are discouraging, again, sweets, refined cereals, fried food, fast food, and processed meats. Again, processed meat like deli meat or bacon. Also for beverages, maximum of 2 sugar-sweetened beverages per week. So like 2 sodas per week, and a maximum of 2 alcoholic drinks per day, preferably red wine, which again, I feel like Italy is synonymous with red wine. I also saw that in a lot of different sources, they mentioned if you're going to drink alcohol for this diet, they are suggesting specifically red wine. And so I guess the $1 million question is, why does the Mediterranean diet or modified Mediterranean diet work so well? Generally, the answer is that we don't know. It could be that this diet is higher in some like potentially like magical ingredient like olive oil or nuts. Also, the Mediterranean diet features because the Mediterranean diet features olive oil as a primary source of fat. So again, like not butter, replacing the butter with olive oil. And olive oil provides monosaturated fat, a type of fat that can help reduce LDL cholesterol levels when used in place of saturated or trans fats. So like when people say, oh, it's a good fat, like when people talk about avocado, that would be the better preferred type of fat as opposed to a butter fat. It could be that this diet is lower in the potentially like evil ingredients like processed meats or refined carbohydrates. It could be a mixture of both. We really don't know. Also, this diet is extremely low in refined carbohydrates like sugar, flour, refined cereals, and the study called them non-foods, which we consider like cereal, like Kellogg's food. But these non-foods like put your blood sugar, insulin, hormones, and neurotransmitters on they call it a dangerous invisible roller coaster that can destabilize your mood and increase risk of insulin resistance, which causes brain damage over time. So that's crazy. So like eating a bunch of the considered non-foods, but like a bunch of sugars, refined carbohydrates, refined cereals, just like all of your refined grains, like all of your white flour that you use for all your baking and everything, and bread, that can actually destabilize your mood and increase your risk for insulin resistance. That's not good. Also, this diet contains plenty of natural fat and cholesterol, which the brain needs to function properly. Although some do argue that the Mediterranean diet unnecessarily limits saturated animal fats, like some fats that are often like related to the keto diet, like just like animal fats like lard, basically. Some people say that this diet limits that and it shouldn't. That's not necessary. But again, the keto diet is a big thing right now, so a lot of people are talking about that. Also, this diet is low in processed. It's low in processed oils from seeds, such as cottonseed, safflower oil, and corn oil. And these are all industry refined oils, which are high in omega-6 fatty acids, not the omega-3s, which are the good ones, but omega-6, which tilt the brain towards inflammation and away from healing, which again, I did not know. That's crazy. Also, it contains animal sources of protein, which are key in brain nutrients such as iron, zinc, and vitamin B12. Meat, seafood, and poultry are all free of anti-nutrients, which interfere with protein and mineral absorption. Also, as I said, I mentioned whole foods. Again, not the store, but this diet is based primarily on whole foods, which humans are already adapted to eating. So our bodies and humans in general have been eating fruits like an apple for way longer than they've been eating, Cheetos. So again, that points to why these types of diets might be good for the body. Also of interest, grains in the Mediterranean region are typically whole grains and usually contain very few unhealthy trans fats. And bread, which is an important part of the diet here that does get eaten in Italy. However, throughout the Mediterranean region, bread is eaten plain or dipped in olive oil, so it's not eaten with like butter or margarine, just like smeared all over it. Also, I want to say besides just fighting depression, the Mediterranean diet does have other benefits. Like research has shown that traditional Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of heart disease. The diet can be associated with a lower level of oxidized low-level lipoprotein cholesterol, which is the LDL cholesterol I mentioned earlier, which the monosaturated fats can help reduce this type of cholesterol, so like olive oil. Because LDL cholesterol is like the bad cholesterol, that's more likely to build up and deposit in your arteries, so that can contribute to heart attacks. Also, the Mediterranean diet is associated with a reduced incidence of cancer, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's disease. And women who eat a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil and mixed nuts may have a reduced risk of breast cancer. Again, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, that you're going to have your depression go away and your cancer is going to leave your body. That's not what I'm saying, but these are healthier diet choices, which, as I mentioned at the very beginning, can contribute to a healthier lifestyle choice. Really, the bottom line is that the Mediterranean diet is superior to like a junk food standard diet filled with like fast food, processed food, fried food, refined carbohydrates, things like that. It can also be affordable and manageable in the real world. If you pay attention to your shopping, maybe try planning ahead a little bit when you're going to the grocery store so you can buy the fruits and veggies and make sure they don't spoil, as opposed to just buying 2 bags of chips, stuffing them in your cabinet and saying, well, now I have snacks for the next 3 weeks because they won't go bad. With a little bit of planning and kind of shopping smart, this diet can be manageable. So I think this is really interesting. I definitely feel like it's going to influence what I eat and cook in 2019. So I'm really excited I got to read it and learn about it. And I hope that everyone out there enjoyed listening to it too. So thank you so much and tune in next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.